Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the 10 UN Academy series, and this is English Nerd. So one of the most common pieces of advice for writers is to show, not tell, but less often do we actually hear what that practically means. You know, how do you troubleshoot a story that has too much telling? How do you actually show? What do you show? And how can you do that really effectively? So what I have for you today is 4 different specific ways that you can show rather than tell, so that your reader is not just watching from afar what's going on, but instead is part of the action and really experiencing what your characters are experiencing. So here we go, 4 ways that you can show, not tell. One way is by cutting out filter words, is what they're often called. So felt, saw, heard, tasted. Instead of saying she felt cold, instead of saying she heard bird song or something like that, take out that she heard, she felt, and instead just show the experience of whatever they're experiencing. So let me give you an example of what this actually looks like. I've written down some examples here because I'm old school like that. I actually just write them down with a pen. So pardon me as I read these options. So option 1, she heard shots in the distance. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, and all of this depends on the sort of voice that you want for your story. But if you're going to show rather than tell this situation, don't say she heard shots, say something more like shots sounded in the distance. Then you don't have that extra layer in between the reader and the experience. Instead, you put the reader in the shoes of the person who's experiencing this. Another example would be she saw crowds of people versus crowds pressed in around her. So instead of she saw, we just experience what she's seeing, crowds pressed in. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is use vivid imagery. This depends on being really specific, almost bravely specific. Who's going to care about this tiny detail? Now, what I'm not saying is that you need to go into tons of detail about how things feel and smell and look. Some people love that level of description. Awesome, if that's your cup of tea, but that's not what you need. Instead, every description should be specific enough to be memorable, even if it's really short. This is another way to show rather than tell. So another example for you to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Oh, I forgot to mention, imagery is a word people throw around all the time, and I have a video all about specific imagery if you want to check that out. But imagery is actually sensory description. That's all it means. So description that very specifically appeals to sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. I think I listed them all there. So instead of saying the house was dirty, that's telling us that the house is dirty, demonstrate it for us through vivid imagery. So you could say something like, cobwebs laced the corners, we can see that, right? And a brown film coated the teetering dishes in the sink. Nasty, and we can see it very clearly. So we have some vivid sight imagery there. Or you could go with different senses rather than sight. A lot of people rely very heavily on visual imagery, which is perfectly fine, but just don't forget the other kinds. It can be so powerful to involve other senses in the experience of whatever it is that you're hoping that your reader experiences. So again, the house was dirty. The little scraping nails of rodents skittered across the floor. The walls smelled musty. So we have hearing, we have smell. So all of this gets across the idea that the house is dirty without just saying it. One way that you can check and see if you're leaning more toward telling rather than showing is by looking for to be verbs. In my first example there, it was the house was dirty. Was is a to be verb. So a form of to be, that would be is, was, were, being, been, one of those. So You don't need to cut those out of your work entirely. Sometimes it's going to make sense to use, but if you use a lot of those, then that can be a red flag that you're just telling people what is, rather than having them experience what is. Okay, so number 3, demonstrate how emotions feel physically. One of the most common ways that people tell instead of show is by saying what emotions people are experiencing. You know, sadness overwhelmed her, anger, he felt angry, that kind of thing. Instead of telling us how people feel, it is better to show us how they feel. Yes, that can mean giving us a glimpse into their thought process, and often it does. But one of the most powerful ways I've found to show emotions rather than just telling the reader about them is by giving a physical description of what that means. So Jenna Moresi, who's another author, tuber, says, get inside your body and feel, what does it actually physically feel like to experience these emotions? And this is another place where, especially here, you need to be vulnerable and honest with yourself. Don't just go with what you've read in the past. Sure, when people are embarrassed, their face feels hot, but how do you feel when you're embarrassed? Like, be really in touch with how you physically feel. Does your throat close up? Do your fingers kind of go numb? Is there a prickling sensation on your skin? So that's what I'm talking about, that kind of physical sensation. And if you describe that well, then you won't need to say, she's sad, he's angry, etc. You can just help the reader, once again, experience it, be in the shoes of your main character and feel it for themselves. So here's an example. Instead of saying something like, sadness overtook her at the news, which is fine, but it's pretty telly, write something like, her body went cold, as though fingers crushed her throat, all breath was gone. We feel that physically, and we understand that she is shocked and horrified and saddened by whatever news this is. Okay, and then my last recommendation for showing instead of telling is when you're talking about big events. So in your story, you might talk about a war or something that is really large scale. Now, probably you are going to need to explain just straight up some of that, but as much as possible, you don't want to pause and go, let's just describe this for a moment. Instead, you want to weave in the importance of these big events. And there are lots of different ways to do that. But one way that you can show instead of tell the impact of big events is this: write small to demonstrate bigger impacts, bigger events. So, for example, here, instead of saying the war had ravaged this part of the city, which is fine, but once again, it's telling us, it's not showing us and putting us in the shoes of your MC. You could say something like, deep scorch marks dotted the road. So we get some detail there. As we wove around the pits and skeletal husks of buildings, a bright object caught his attention. Beside a well whose handle had been wrenched off lay a child's red sock. So it's kind of a common example to have like a child's sock, child's shoe as kind of a symbol for the atrocities of war. So I know it's a bit of a cliched example, but you can see that there's some specific detail. There's the scorch marks in the road that they specifically have to weave around. There's the well with the handle wrenched off, and then you have this child's sock. So all of these things, instead of saying war had ravaged this part of the city, you see it, you feel it, you feel how deep that goes, both, like emotionally, environmentally, all of that you feel because you've been shown it rather than just told it. So hopefully this is helpful. I know this kind of thing would have been helpful for me, especially starting out, but I've spent some time sort of researching these things and how to do them better. So hopefully this is all helpful for you. Make sure to like this video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe for more English nerdy goodness, and I will see you next Monday.